Working on the cloud is definitely great, but a major drawback during the development stage is having to deploy your application each time before you can test the new changes. In this video, we'll be showing you how to set up a local environment to test your serverless applications without deploying to the cloud. In particular, we'll be setting up a local API gateway service integrated with Lambda functions that operate on a DynamoDB table. And of course, there's many different ways to set up a local simulated cloud environment for serverless applications, but for this video, we'll be using some plugins attached to the serverless framework. Now, I know you're all excited, so let's dive right in. So the first thing that we want to do is install all our necessary dependencies. Now, the first of which is going to be the serverless module, which just comes as serverless, and this essentially gives us access to the serverless CLI and other resources. We also need serverless offline. This essentially gives us access to a local version of AWS Lambda and API gateway. And on top of that, we also need serverless DynamoDB local, and this gives us a local version of DynamoDB. So these are all the node modules that we will be needing today. Aside from that, an optional module that we can, an optional dependency that we can install is also the AWS CLI, and we only need it for a small step, but this is optional, and we'll go over in a second why it is actually optional. So let's head over to your editor. We'll just be using VS Code in this case, and you may have noticed we're actually going to be building off an existing project, which is the CRUD API that we built for DynamoDB in a previous video. And the reason we're doing that is just so that we don't have to work completely from scratch, so we can just get started with this. So the first thing we want to do is, you can just open up your terminal. I'm going to close that. So once you've opened up your terminal, you can just hit npm I, or you can use yarn as well, but we're going to install this globally, so we'll attach that flag. And we're going to type in all the three node modules that we're going to install. So that's going to be serverless, serverless DynamoDB local, and last but not least, serverless-offline. So these are three modules that we'll install globally. I've already installed them, so we won't run this command again. Once that is done, we can actually begin using the AWS CLI in this step. I'm just going to run through it quickly, and then I'll explain why it's optional. But once you have installed the AWS CLI, according to the documentation page for AWS, you can just type in AWS to activate the CLI and call the configure command, and we'll just let that run. And this will essentially prompt us to set an AWS access key ID. And obviously, we will not be using an actual AWS access key ID in here. We'll just set a random, like any string whatsoever. I'm just going to call this access_key ID. You can name it 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever you want. We'll hit enter. It'll prompt us for the secret access key ID. I'm going to name it as such, secret access key ID. We'll hit enter. The default region name, we'll just use US West-2. As you can see, I've actually already set it, but I'll just hit enter for the sake of demonstrating. You can include JSON here. I'm just going to hit enter to keep it empty. And awesome. So once all those credential values have been set, we can go ahead and take a look at where these values are persisted. If I can just magnify this. Okay, awesome. So what you can do is you can go ahead and use Vim or whatever you wish, and just open up the file under .aws /config. And this will essentially tell us the general configuration stuff that we have set, such as the region. If we set the format, like such as JSON, it would also appear here as well. But aside from that, we can also look into the credentials file under the same path. If we open that up, we can see that the AWS access key ID and secret access key ID have been set to the values that we have just specified. And of course, the reason why using the AWS CLI is optional is because we can actually just generate these files ourselves. As you can see, it's not very complicated. The syntax and pretty much the format is all included on the AWS documentation page for the CLI. So you can just copy and paste that and create the file yourself. But of course, the CLI offers other tools as well that might be handy. So if you already have it, definitely feel free to use it. So now once the local credentials have been set successfully, we can close this off, and now we can actually head over to our code. So if you recall in my previous video where we built this project, we used DynamoDB's client, and we actually instantiated a new client here. And depending on what AWS resource you're using, this may look a bit different. For example, if you're using S3, we would insert the same set of credentials and configuration setup fields into your S3 client initialization. But we're just going to be using DynamoDB here, and the fields that we want to include are as such. So the first thing is going to be the region. This is just going to be the region of which you want your application to be deployed to. I'm just going to be using US West-2. We also want to specify the access key ID. And as mentioned before, or as you saw earlier, the access key ID we use is just access underscore key underscore ID. And similarly for the secret access key ID, we just wrote a pseudo value or any value for that matter. Your value might be different, but definitely don't use a real value here just because we're only using this for local development purposes. But yeah, the last thing we want to specify is just the endpoint here. This is just going to be the endpoint that we have, of which DynamoDB will have access to. So this is just going to be localhost running on port 8000 by default. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the db.js file, or basically the configuration file of how your client will integrate into your local setup. So once that is done, the last thing we want to do is head over to our serverless.yaml file, and we're just going to specify a few fields here. So the first thing we want to do is actually just import all the plugins that we have installed earlier. The first of which is going to be serverless DynamoDB local. The next of which is going to be serverless-offline. And we're going to hit save. And each of these actually has its own set of configurations that you can set up depending on your use case and like how granular you want your lambdas to be, or how specific you want your lambdas to be. But in this case, we're just using generic lambdas, a generic API. So we're going to keep it at its very basic level and its really basic level of settings as well. So the first thing we want to do is actually create a new custom variable, which is where these two plugins will read from in terms of its setup. So as for the DynamoDB setup, we're just going to create a field called DynamoDB. And one thing that we need to specify is the stages. And this is going to be the set of stages that we will allow our DynamoDB table to be activated on or instantiated on. I'm just going to include dev here because we're currently in the development stage. The next one is going to be called start. And start is essentially the set of commands or flags that we want to specify when we run the serverless DynamoDB local start command. The one field that we want to include is migrate, and we want to set this as true. And essentially what this will do is that because we have instantiated or initialized the configuration to deploy a DynamoDB table below here, when we set the migrate to field to true, it will essentially deploy this table with all its schemas and properties associated to it locally. So it will set that up for us locally, and we will have access to it. So yeah, we're going to leave it like that. The last thing we want to set is the serverless -offline configuration. And we only need one thing here. This is optional depending on the configuration that you're using for your lambdas. But basically it's called resource routes, and you need to set this to true if you are using a HTTP proxy integration for your lambdas. So I'm just going to make a quick comment of that. I'm going to set it to true, but of course, depending on your implementation, you may not need to. And yeah, so that's pretty much it in terms of all the setup. We're going to quickly start this up and run it locally, and we'll demonstrate how it all works. So to get this started, the first thing we want to do is head over back to the package page for the serverless DynamoDB local package, and we can just review the documentation. Basically, it tells us that we need to run this command first, sls DynamoDB install, and essentially this will install a local version of DynamoDB for us and basically set everything up. And after that, we can actually scroll down to the section that mentions how we can integrate it with serverless offline right over here. And basically it says that the next command we should be running is serverless DynamoDB start, but because we are using it with the serverless offline plugin, we only need to start that up, and automatically it should also start our DynamoDB service as well. So we're going to head over to our terminal. I just have one open here, and we can enter the command serverless DynamoDB install. So we're going to let that run. It might take a moment here. Awesome. Okay, so now that it's complete and it's installed in our project directory, so definitely make sure before you run this command to be checked into your project directory that you want to basically run your application on. And so once that is done and all installed successfully, we can just begin to run the command SLS or serverless offline start, and make sure to include the start command as well. And we'll just give it a second to load up. And this is basically will run all the other commands behind the scenes and launch our AWS Lambda, as well as the API Gateway Service and the DynamoDB tables. And as you can see here, DynamoDB local has been started. We'll just give it a second for the Lambdas to launch as well. As you can see here, it's deploying. Awesome. Okay, so this is like a local deployment. I realized I made a small, I guess you can call it an issue, not really. Basically, I forgot to change the region for the Lambdas, but that should be okay. The Lambdas can be in a different region than your DynamoDB table. It might not be as performant in a production environment, but just change this, I guess, to the same environment as your table when you're shipping this to production. But it's for development right now, so it doesn't really matter. But as you can see here, all our Lambdas that are listed in our serverless configuration file are also listed here as they are now deployed locally. And all the available endpoints are also listed as well. So we can just go ahead and quickly test this. I've opened up Postman, have this brief configured, and we can just run our get endpoint right now. There should be nothing in the table, especially nothing with post ID of 1. I have a batch endpoint here as well. I'm going to hit run as well. And we can see that there's no items in the table right now. And if we just hit post using our create endpoint, as you can see here, we have successfully created one. And if we go back to our batch endpoint, we can see that the entry that we have uploaded just now can be retrieved successfully. And just for demonstration for purposes for completion, let's just run the put endpoint. I've already included sample outputs from my previous video. We can see that it's been updated. And if we look at the response here, we can see that the number of views and the author have both been updated from as compared to the original values. And last but not least, let's just go ahead and delete this thing. And once that has been deleted, we can go ahead and check our batch endpoint. And as you can see here, everything is gone. So as you can see, all the endpoints work successfully. If we just minimize this and look back at the terminal, we can see all the logs of every single request that was made to all our endpoints. So that's why it's nice to have another terminal window open here just to see any logs, especially if you're debugging along the way. Now, of course, we've only demonstrated how to connect your DynamoDB locally in this video, but you've now learned the necessary configuration steps that can be extrapolated to other AWS resources as well. So that wraps up this video, and as always, I hope you're all staying happy and well out there, but for now, take care.